A brief summary of the origin of the Negro slave trade. Book by Matthias Christian Sprengel. Summarized by Tobias George Smollett. Professor Sprengel proposes to publish a complete history of the Negro slave trade from its rise to the present time, and the present publication may be considered both as the introduction to, and a specimen of, that larger work. The scene of the slave trade extends far beyond Guinea, though that coast furnishes the Europeans with the greater number of slaves for their American and West Indian colonies. The Portuguese, indeed, still procure slaves from their East African settlements, especially Mozambique, and the French transport small numbers of slaves from Madagascar to Ile-de-France and Bourbon. It is generally imagined that the Europeans were the first who taught the Negroes this cruel branch of trade, but the poor Negroes had already tasted of the hardest slavery long before the arrival of the Portuguese on their coasts. No barbarous nation has ever so far forgotten the rights and dignity of human nature as these African Negroes. With them, friends or foes are alike reduced to slavery, whenever they have the misfortune of offending their lords, or falling into the hands of a stronger man. All Negroes are born slaves of their masters, by whom they are doomed to death or sale, not only for trifling offences but from mere ill-humour, and often to sale, merely to gratify their master's thirst after brandy. As far as their history can be traced, the northern neighbours of the Negroes, the Arabs in Morocco, were the first who purchased slaves of the Negroes. Ever since the year of Christ 990, the Moroccans had extended their conquests to the northern banks of the Senegal, and from that time there are continual traces of an intercourse between these two nations. By these conquerors the Arabic language, circumcisions, the Koran and some other rites of Mahometism, and even some fort of civilization, not yet entirely lost among the black tribes beyond the river of Gambia, were introduced among the Negroes. The first account of the Negroes' trade of the Moors in northern Africa is to be found in the Nubian Geographer, page 8, of the Latin version. This trade was still carried on in the 15th century, when the Portuguese began to establish new marts for the slaving trade on the coast, as appears from the frequent accounts of their first navigators. Even now, a bartering trade of horses against men is continued between the Negroes and Moroccans, a trade which the immense annual exportations of slaves by Europeans to America have not yet stopped. In order not to lose this branch of trade, the Moroccans fell none but stone horses to the Negroes on the Senegal. The first rivals of the Arabs for the slaving trade were the Portuguese, since 1445, whose preceding voyages were made merely in continuation of the war against the Arabs, whom King Alphonsus III had expelled from his dominions. The kidnapping pursuits of the Portuguese were favoured by the papal donation of the new discovered countries, till Prince Henry, who meant to improve the discovery in Africa, to other purposes than merely for the extirpation of Mahometism, forbade the kidnapping to his navigators. Pope Nicholas V, in that famous bull, by which he granted the unknown world to the Portuguese and Spaniards, expressly permitted and ordered the Christians to reduce all infidels into slavery, an order zealously executed by both these nations. In the meanwhile the Portuguese were advancing nearer and nearer to the countries abounding in gold, and discovered in the progress of their navigation many useful and valuable articles of trade. That of pepper now found by them gave the first shock to the East India trade, till then carried on by the Venetians. In order to procure plenty of pepper, a spice of which incredible quantities were confused in those ages, and of other merchandises, the Portuguese were obliged to cease kidnapping and hostilities, and to purchase slaves instead of carrying them off by force. Since it has been carried on by the Europeans, this slave trade has undergone but few great changes. It is still carried on within its ancient limits along the sea-coast, though it now reaches farther up into the inland countries of Africa, and the fame articles of trade which had already been imported by the Arabs are still eagerly fought for by the Negroes. Only the number of European traders and settlements has greatly increased, and the Portuguese have lost their monopoly on the coast. Professor Sprengel divides the history of the Negro trade, carried on by Christians, into two principal periods, the first from 1443 to 1645, and the second from 1645 to the present times, that is, the 1800s. The first period is the time of its increase, during which not only its founders, the Portuguese, but the English, the Dutch, and the French dealt in Negro slaves, though chiefly for the use and consumption of the Spaniards, and the sugar and tobacco plantations in the Brazils. During the latter period, these four nations were obliged to share that trade with the Swedes, the Danes, the Brandenburgers, that is, the Germanic Holy Roman Empire, the North Americans, and since 1778 with the Spaniards. Their trade, however, still increased, not only by the Swedes and Brandenburgers ceasing their navigations to the coast of Guinea, but from the annual demand of a supply of more than 100,000 Negro recruits for their own colonies. The Portuguese endeavoured to exclude other nations from Guinea, whilst the rest of the European navigators were, in spite of papal bulls and all the reports industriously spread of the pretended dangers of that coast, striving to get a share of that profitable gold trade. The discovery of the Gold Coast served, indeed, yet more to enlarge the sphere of the navigation of the Portuguese than their slave trade, but it forced them also to extend themselves on the coasts, and to fettle colonies in Congo, Angola, and other places which they had till then neglected. Prince Henry's colonies were enlarged by his successors. King John II, in 1492, expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas of Africa, which had been discovered in 1471, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa, and from there banished Jews, the Black Portuguese as they are called, and the Jews in Congo, who are despised even by the very Negroes, are descended. By these colonists, St. Thomas soon became a considerable place of trade, and valuable for its sugar plantations. 30 years after their settlement, not less than 156,000 arrobes of 30 pounds weight each of sugar were exported, and the engines of 60 sugar works turned by slaves. These Negroes were purchased in Guinea, Congo, Angola, and Gabon, and the colonists had plantations furnished with from 150 to 3,000 Negro slaves. In the beginning of the 16th century, the Spaniards and Portuguese began to transport Negroes for similar labours to the West Indies and Brazils, by which the Negro trade was rapidly increased. The Spaniards, on their first settling in the West Indies, immediately treated the natives of that part of the globe according to the Pope's instruction. They divided them by families or districts among themselves as slaves. The poor Indians were now forced to dive for pearls, to wash gold sand, and to work gold and silver mines for their new masters. They were often carried far from their native homes, and in short, they were so miserably fed and used that in a short time these countries were entirely depopulated. In order to supply that loss, the Spaniards carried off the other Indians, who were not yet subdued by stratagem or force, especially from the Lucayan Islands. The Spanish court at last prohibited those violences, but the Spaniards soon found means for evading the orders of their court. They decried the Indians in Europe as the most sanguinary race of savages, on which Ferdinand repealed his former orders, and bade them carry off these cannibals by force from their native places, and to treat and fell them as slaves. With a great deal of pains and dangers, the Spaniards now carried away the number of labourers wanted for their exigencies, but soon found them too weak to support long and hard labours. Bishop Las Cafes is generally thought to have been the first who advised the Spaniards to import slaves from Africa, in order to spare the Indians, but our author shewer that before that time Moorish and even Negro slaves were sent to America. Las Cafas's merits consisted in saving South America from an entire depopulation. What before him had been already done by private Spanish individuals, he procured to be done by a general royal order, or he proposed Negroes instead of the few Moorish slaves who had till then been sent to America. He also deserved well of the commerce of America, by procuring by his remonstrances that the Negro slaves who before, like all other necessaries, had been sent from Seville or other Spanish harbours, were to be directly transported from Guinea to the West Indies, and that, of courier, America was more expeditiously furnished with the labourers wanted. The author confines his relation of the first Negro trade to that carried on by the Portuguese and Spaniards. At Gonzales was the first Portuguese who in 1442 returned with Negro slaves, purchased, instead of the Africans who had till then been carried off by mere violence. But soon after the Portuguese became better acquainted with the African regions and their valuable productions. Prince Henry founded the first Guinea Company, that settled factories in the fortress of Arguin and got the exclusive privilege of trading with the Arabs. The trade soon increased, so that in 1455 not less than 700 or 800 Negro slaves were annually exported to Lisbon. The Portuguese in 1471 discovered the Gold Coast, and ever since the intercourse between Portugal and Guinea was continued. Las Casas's proposal was executed in 1517. The Court of Trade at Seville appointed 4,000 Negroes to be annually transported to the islands of Domingo, Fernandina, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica, and Charles V granted the monopoly of this slave trade to his councillor and major domo de la Brefa for 8 years, who in his turn sold his grant for that time to some Genoese, for 2,500 ducats. The trade of these farmers probably ceased with the term of the 8 years, as the Genoese sold their slaves too dear, and as the Portuguese were become very jealous of the trade of other nations to Guinea. The number of slaves annually exported from Guinea now rose from year to year. Besides those wanted by the Portuguese for their own settlements in Africa, or sold by them to the Spaniards in the West Indies, great numbers of Negroes were also wanted for the Brazils, which had been lately discovered. The importance of that fruitful country, which for a long time remained a place of exile, was not known till about the middle of the 15th century. Some of its forced colonists had imitated there the management of the sugar plantations in St. Thomas and Madeira with much success, that both their islands lost their sugar trade, and the Portuguese were enabled to monopolize the slave trade. Towards the latter end of the 16th century, the Brazils annually received 28,000 Negro slaves from Angola only, and some of its planters are said to have been possessed of not less than 10,000 slaves and 18 sugar works. Even then they used to mark the slaves with hot irons, and they also employed Brazilians carried off by force from the inland parts of the country. The permissions for thus kidnapping and carrying off the natives into slavery were openly followed by the Portuguese governors, and these licensed kidnappers fetched their commodities from the most inaccessible forests and wildernesses. To the end of the 16th century, the Negro slave trade was carried on only by Portuguese and Spanish merchants, who fetched their slaves from the Portuguese settlements. When the Portuguese became subjects to Spain, under Philip II, they engrossed the whole Spanish Negro trade to themselves. Spain entirely ceased her trade to Guinea and to the islands of Cape Verde, and from that time to the peace concluded at Pardo, suffered her colonies to be furnished with Negroes by other nations. John Hawkins, a dealer in slaves, got, in 1565, the first potatoes, for ship provisions, from the inhabitants of Santa Fe in New Spain. He introduced the root into Ireland, whence it was farther propagated through all the northern parts of Europe. In 1640, the Portuguese lost the most profitable branch of their Negro trade, with the liberty of trading to the Spanish Indies, on account of the revolution of Portugal. As the Spaniards themselves could not trade to Guinea, on account of their war with Portugal, Dutch merchants offered to carry on that trade for them. The Dutch had traded with Guinea for gold ever since 1593, and whilst they were masters of the Brazils, they also carried on a considerable slave trade. But their proposals were declined by the Chamber or Court of Trade at Seville. In 1662, the Crown contracted again for 7 years with 2 Italians, of the name of Grilli, for slaves. This company of the Grilli purchased their slaves from the English, the Dutch, the French, and the Danes, who had then settled in Guinea. But this trade probably declined and ceased when the Spanish power was so exceedingly weakened towards the end of the last century. The author has subjoined some additions. First, a minute account of the English settlements on the Gold Coast and in Senegambia. The second, of the present price of slaves. Formerly a Negro slave was to be got so cheap as for a few yards of coarse cloth, and towards the end of the last century, the Negroes sold a full-grown Negro slave for 2 or 3 quarts of brandy. But the price has since been greatly raised by the 7 competition of European slave merchants. That price depends on the peaceable or warlike disposition of the Negro princes, and on the greater or smaller number of flaying ships. It is also greatly influenced by the nature of the European commodities, where the dealers never used to purchase slaves with any one single commodity, but always contrive to mix dear and cheap articles with a great deal of cunning and profit. The English are said to purchase at present an able full-grown slave on the coast of Africa for 23 or 241. Value in commodities, though these are said to be in fact worth only about 181. The slaving vessels retail their slaves again in America, at the rate of 50 per head, but in larger parcels comprising men and women they may be got at the rate of 361 per head. This, however, is to be understood of Negroes, fit only so sugar works, for such as are fit for other sorts of work are paid for according to their skill, and in a scarcity of hands, sometimes even at 4 times the price of ordinary Negro slaves.